Okay. The time is 6:42. I'll call the Newcastle Planning Board meeting to order. Today is December 19th, 2024. And first thing before we dive in, I wanted to say thank you and welcome to Tyler Tibbetts for joining the planning board. Much appreciated. Thank you. And we're one short today, and we're still looking for at least one more, if not two more, so that I can wrap up at some point. So if anyone knows anyone, please send the word and we'll see if they're interested. Okay, so diving right in, we've got review of the minutes from the November 21st meeting. Have a motion to accept the minutes.
So moved.
Moved by Scott, seconded by Wanda. Does anybody have any comments, corrections, anything to say about the minutes? Seeing none, all looks good. All in favor of accepting the minutes?
I was absent.
You were absent and you were not here yet. So we're going to say 3 yeses, 2 abstains.
Yes. Yep, cool, great. Lucas
Excellent.
abstains, Kevin's absent, Scott abstains. Sorry, Tyler abstains.
Tyler. Yes. Scott moved. Yes. All right. Item 3 on the agenda amendments. Are there any last minute changes to the agenda?
There some discussion items if we want to continue to talk about roads generally, and I have some just general update about building types that isn't really ready to like dive into tonight, but
Preview.
yeah, I'd like to at least, prime that up. So,
Great.
but it falls pretty much in line with potential ordinance amendments.
Okay. That works. We have no old business. We have no new business. So this is basically just a workshop. And last meeting of the year. A short workshop.
That would be nice.
We're not going to be here for 2 hours. But we do have some things to discuss. And I think we'll start with the planning board work plan for 2025. That works for everybody? I'll give you all a second with your new new devices to find what we're looking at here. It's the 6A planning board work list PDF. All right, everybody good? So this was, thank you for doing it this way.
I cleaned it up a little bit.
Yeah. No, it's good. And we can look at this and we can already check some of this stuff off. Sorry.
Got the lemon.
I got the one that you sent me on my person.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That's what I'm using. I didn't see it on there. So.
All
Yeah.
right.
All right. Where are we? 6A.
6A.
All right.
So yeah, the PDF, that's the work plan or work list. So originally we had developed this back in August 2022. Because the select board asked us to do it at the time. And last month we were just sort of remembering that maybe we should just revisit it. Both as an exercise to plan what we're going to maybe tackle for the coming year, but also to remind ourselves where we've been and what we've already done and accomplished, which is a good thing. So things I want to just sort of shout out that we've accomplished this year, which is wonderful. Shoreland zoning, we have updated it to chapter 1000. That was a long slog haul that required 2 public votes. But we finally did it as of the last meeting. At Great Salt Bay. What was that last week? I can't even remember.
So,
Yeah. So shoreland zoning is now, fingers crossed, 100% chapter 1000. I know you don't know what that is yet, Tyler.
State of Maine.
Yeah, state of Maine model ordinance that the state makes us, adopt these standards for shoreland. So we're now compliant.
And even not, I wouldn't say beyond that, but we also managed to kick timber harvesting and administration of timber harvesting to the state, which is nice. And I think we also were able to implement a a general development district in the downtown.
Yep.
Because there's sewer and water there, which we're allowed to do in shoreline, but is kind of we didn't have it.
Right.
So,
That's a big deal. So then down to the bottom where it says goals, we did in fact adopt planning board bylaws 2 years ago. We've reviewed them twice, which is wonderful. If you don't have a copy of them, we'll make sure you get a copy of them.
Please put that on the list.
Yep. And we have been working, Michael and Kevin and all the town staff have been working. The second item there is to identify and implement clear boundaries between CEO, planning board, and planner. And that work has been ongoing, mostly because traditionally, before we had professional staff doing our planning services, CEO kind of handled everything in this town, which is it's a lot. And so now working towards having even more clear boundaries between what the CEO actually does, what the planning board should do, what the planner does. It's been, I think, very helpful, not just for the planning board, but for applicants, which has been a wonderful thing. Couple of things up from that: permit applications forms, permit review checklist, finding a facts approved deny form. All of those things are either done. We have implemented finding a facts approved and deny form at all of our application reviews now, which is great. Application forms are in progress.
Yeah.
They're close.
There's a lot of new ones that are on the website that was essentially Kevin rolled out.
Mhm.
And, I had updated them and gave him to review, and he was like, let's just go.
Let's just do it.
So, so we can obviously amend those, but in his role as CEO lately, seems like they're working.
Yeah,
So
great. Good. And I don't know, that's probably the big stuff that we have.
that's the stuff that's there. And then there's other stuff that's come up that is under the Newcastle Select Board priorities down at the bottom.
Yeah.
Like firearm moratorium or updating the firearm retail firearm sales.
Mhm.
Did that, got into the Community Resilience Partnership, which really was Kevin and BPI. So I guess LD 2003 stuff.
Yeah, that's right. We spent a while on LD 2003.
Yep.
And we brought that in July, so that's part of the ordinance. So, I mean, we continue to do work, but as you can see, there's a lot still left on the plate. And I'm not sure exactly how we want to approach this, because there's work that's already ongoing, and then I think there's, a short conversation that maybe needs to be had about just sort of high level thinking about what's the next big thing we're going to pick off and work towards. And then are there other low hanging fruit that we can do this year as well? And I guess at this point, I'd probably like to just turn it over to you and have you give us an update.
So yeah, you covered everything that I have that we completed, at least since I've been here. Then there's other work that was done before I got here. There's a couple of things that aren't on here, which are kind of ongoing right now, which is changes that we'll discuss today, potentially to additional structures, window and store standards, but mostly in the fabrication district, and then removing the minimum unit size that we put in for LD 2003, and now we're going to take out for LD 2003. But the conversation that I've had with Kevin is hopefully we can kind of just bite that off and have it done in time for a spring special town meeting. Since essentially we're doing them quarterly. But then beyond that, what we'd like to do, what should, I think that, to your point, like what's the next, bigger thing that we want to take on, but also what other, I think the conversation that we probably will get into a little bit is building types and any other, not like, hopefully not hugely structural changes, but what other kind of medium things that as time permits do we want to try and make progress on? Because that's something that nailing down our priority list would be very helpful for me. And when there isn't an application, like I did a bunch of work for the fabrication, for the blood property. And then once that stops, it's like, okay, now what am I supposed to be working on? And so being able to kind of be like, all right, this is what gets put on hold when an application comes in. This is what gets picked up when there's not an application. That direction for you all would be very helpful.
So my thought is, I mean, we can pick what we want to do, but do we want to ask the selectmen what, what some of their priorities are and what they would like to see us working on, so that we don't start working on something and then they hand us something else.
Right.
I mean, I don't know what their thoughts are about what they're.
Well,
working on
that's-
either, so.
What I had the conversation with Kevin about, because I gave him this list too and said, if you've got any thoughts before we go to the planning board tonight. And I figure whatever the planning board kind of comes up with, we can make those recommendations to the select board and say, here's what the planning board kind of thought would be relevant, and then the select board can take that into consideration. And if they want to say, no, focus on this, great. Do you think that'll, you can make some headway on that, go for it. So I don't think we're gonna go rogue.
No, I don't think we're gonna go rogue, and a lot of this stuff dovetails. So, I mean, for example, I think one of the things that we know, besides, as we review applications and we find things where like, do we need to think about addressing that standard or set of standards or definition or whatever, clean up stuff. That stuff is just going to continue to ongo. But the village partnership, the VPI Village Partnership Initiative,
What is that?
it has been a process that the town started in partnership with the Maine Department of Transportation, DOT. Basically, the way it works is if a town partners with DOT to think about doing improvements to areas of town transportation, type improvements specifically geared towards, in this case, villages, then the DOT will work with you, provide funding to you. You get on the work plan a little bit quicker, ideally, and you get a lot of funding. So the first round that we just went through was the engineering and design phase of the process. It was a 50-50 match. In other words, they gave us 50% of the funds. We put in 50% of the funds to pay a consultant to create some engineering. We had 3 public workshops over the past year.
Yeah, at least, plus maybe one that was just stakeholders, which was public, but.
Right. And so like the engineers that we hired, they went out and they did traffic counts and they did all kinds of traffic studies and everything. And then they created some diagrams about how we could improve essentially the intersection at the bottom of Academy Hill in front of.
That was the exact one I was
Yes,
assuming we
right.
were talking
Yeah.
about. Like,
That's priority 1.
right?
And then priority 2 was the intersection of the River Road coming up onto the off
Yeah.
where you get that series of one-way things, sort of cleaning that up. So that is ongoing, but so far the engineering is done. It's put to bed at the moment. Round 2, phase 2 would be actually working with the DOT. It would go through their engineering department, put on their work plan eventually, and then it'd be a 90-10 split. They pay for 90% of the project if it gets greenlit, and we'd only have to come up with 10%. So
So why wouldn't
why
The
wouldn't we
village-
do it?
why wouldn't any village or town want to partner with the state for
A lot of
90% of?
Yes.
Is it because they don't have the 10%?
Well,
See
you
what I'm
gotta,
saying?
put up to 50% for like all the engineering. So I don't know how much that ended up being, but it wasn't.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
It wasn't like $1,000. It was
Oh,
like
no.
pretty.
Yeah.
It was a chunk of change.
It was, yeah.
You're paying the state to listen to you pretty much to
Absolutely.
get their attention.
Yes. But I mean, just to back up, the reason the DOT created this program, this initiative, is because they kind of got tired of proposing projects in towns that everyone hated.
Well, there you go.
And railed against. And so they said, well, let's try it a different way. Let's try and partner with the towns and get, citizen buy-in, get the community behind us. And then by the time the project actually starts being constructed, everyone knows what's going on, and they don't hate us. They're thankful and grateful that we're here and we're doing the work.
And it's not a surprise.
It's not a surprise, and it's what they wanted us to do
Mhm.
instead of us being the dictators of the situation.
What did Wisconsin pay for bypass studies that went nowhere? I can't even
Yeah.
imagine what we paid.
Starting at like 1964,
Long time
the
ago.
past 60 years of Wisconsin.
I don't
mean,
even want
that
to
was
add it up.
Like the prime,
It's exactly, that's right. Yeah.
and we still have the bridge.
Yes. Well, and like, the example of people chaining themselves to trees when they were trying to do the widening
Warren.
down in
Yeah.
Warren. And the DOT got so much flack for that project. They just basically paved the road and they walked away. And I don't think they've done anything since. Because it was a nightmare for them. It was a nightmare for everyone. But anyway, so here's just coming back to this list here. One of the things that we know we need to address is our roads, driveways, and entrances ordinance. And the first thing under create transportation and mobility ordinance that contains and addresses the following things. The current ordinance, sidewalks, special event management, street lighting, parking on street, municipal parking, speed limits, weight limits, posting road classifications. These are all things that we loosely have some stuff for, but not comprehensively. Bicycle mobility, street trees. Basically, if you're familiar with the concept of complete streets, if you're not, that's fine. But a complete street is basically, it's the best, easiest way to find what a complete street.
Yes, streets that are designed to accommodate a wider mix of users beside focusing only on people driving.
Right. So it includes, it puts pedestrians and bicyclists and other things that are street adjacent or vehicular adjacent that are still in the public realm, puts them in the same level of sort of priority of care when considering projects. Instead of just like, how do we move vehicles as fast as possible from point A to point B? Well, there's other concerns. And so a lot of towns in the country have adopted what are called complete streets ordinances, and they contain all of this stuff. And if we were to choose to create a better ordinance or roll it into the core zoning code instead of being its own ordinance or whatever the case may be, it'd be apropos timing to get that in place before any construction happened with the VPI, which is honestly probably somewhere between 5 and 10 years out. But it could take a while to do.
Big project.
It's a big project. It's not a small thing.
I think that makes sense. The thing with that I just want to say about complete streets ordinances is a lot of times it's not just saying like, oh, every time you redo a street, you have to put a bike lane in or you have to put 10-foot sidewalks or whatever it is. A lot of times it is simply when you're redoing a street, restriping, repaving, rebuilding, you need to at least consider sidewalks and bike lanes. And it might be like, no, this doesn't make any sense here because the bridge is too narrow to, if you put a bike lane, you're gonna end up with 4-foot traffic, car lanes. Doesn't make sense. But just to make sure that you don't just overlook it, because it's easy to do that given the last 50 years of traffic engine.
Yeah, I mean, other small examples that make a huge impact for people are if you have as part of your ordinance something that says when you rebuild a road that's adjacent to a sidewalk or you rebuild the sidewalk, you need to do your best to make it ADA compliant.
Mhm.
We don't have anything right now that says that. And so things like tip downs, dimple boards for people who are, visually impaired. Those are all things that should be considered that often aren't because it's just, well, just get it in there. And so, oftentimes we don't even have the tip downs. It's just a step off the sidewalk, right? Well, what if you're in a wheelchair? Curbs are a problem. Curbs are great, but they're a problem.
Well, you're right.
So little things like that where it's like, another great one that if Louis Rector were here, he and I argue about it until the end of time. But utility companies love to place their utility poles right in, you're laughing already, right in sidewalks,
In the middle of the.
in the middle of the sidewalk.
100%.
And the reason for that is because they don't have to get an easement
From a private
from a
property.
private
owner.
property owner. It's in the public way, but it's not in the travel way. They don't have to do anything. They just drill a hole.
Have any say over that?
Only if we have an ordinance. So if you look around our sidewalks, there's what? Easily half a dozen, 8 that I can think of that are literally just right smack in the middle of the sidewalk, which makes it impossible for anyone in a wheelchair, anyone with a stroller. You know, if you're riding your bike, you got to go out now into traffic and then come back. And I mean, it's not fun.
Yeah.
So it's little things like that where it's like, if you just have something in an ordinance that makes the utility company pause and ask, and you say, well, no, we can't let you put it right in the middle of this.
It'd be for any, if there was no, it'd be any new poles going in.
Right.
Because they still have the easement for the existing pole.
Correct.
So they have to stay within, I think the rule is that they have to stay within 4 feet of the existing pole.
Right.
They can put it wherever they want.
Yes.
Because they've already been granted it. But any new poles that they'd be putting in for anything
Right.
would have to meet the ordinance.
So here's a sort of a broad question, very broad. When I think in terms of tasks, so one of the challenges, certainly one of the challenges when I was working at the hospital was we had so many short-term tasks. It was very difficult to get the long-term ones done because we were always putting a fire out somewhere.
Yeah.
So, and so it seems to me, and I don't, maybe we don't have this board doesn't have this problem, but I would think that a larger task, one that requires more thought and time and what have you, anything that larger task could, if that larger task could be something that streamlines and makes us more efficient in terms of how we administer what we do, I would think that would be a better investment on a large scale project than, you know, picking something off the list, because that carries on forever.
Mhm.
You've made something more efficient, but maybe there's not an efficiency problem. I'm thinking in terms of big projects and little ones. And I'm thinking, if you did a big one, what's a big one that you could do that improves our flow?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there is absolutely, that's a really good point. That's an excellent way to think about it. Another good way to think about it is we can farm some of this out. So we don't have to do this work. We can identify some of it and we can say to Michael, okay, work on that when you can. But if it's big enough, we might say, let's make a recommendation to the select board that they form a subcommittee of the planning board and look for volunteers, and we put them to work with our planner for the next year. And here's your task. Come back to us with what you figure out. Which is another perfectly legitimate way to go. We don't have to do all the work, and we don't have to demand that our planner does all the work. No?
I'm just looking for the gift that keeps on giving.
Like what? What do you?
Oh, just whatever. I don't know. That's the kind of stuff I think about in terms of if we're going to put a lot of effort in something, let's put a lot of effort in something that makes everything better, or
That's,
easier, or
I-
faster.
I couldn't agree more.
yeah, I agree. And that's something that, the permit application forms and the application process, which is not so much something that the planning board is really intimately involved with, but that's a perfect example of, both here and in Dameron out of them trying to do, because the amount of time that I spend on doing like site plan review or application review, and it's like, well, if we just cleaned this up and actually had a form that asks for the information that the ordinance wants, then I don't need to go back and forth between the applicant 6 times. I can just say, and so that's I think a big thing, and I'm really trying to work on that with like the admin process. But if there's anything else that like you all see, I'm all about it, because and then it starts to free up time to work on other stuff.
Well, another big one, and we've talked about this one for quite a while, is the idea of having a non-regulatory companion to the code that is listed here as a visual reference guide. So when we're talking about this building type or that type of roof or this type of component or whatever is in the ordinance, we've actually got something we can turn to like we had before in the original character code.
Oh, gee.
Yes, and say, this is what we're talking about. When we're talking about a stoop, this is the picture of the stoop. It doesn't have to look exactly like this, but this is what we're talking about, right? And then the code is over here, completely separate, but having that visual reference guide even just to describe things as simple as, if you've got a lot, here's how the setbacks work.
Do we not have that?
No,
No.
we don't.
That's very important.
It could be potentially game changing.
I think, and providing some guidance and, almost advice, where you're like, when you're working on this, when you're designing a stoop, consider this, right? And you say like, a porch, just like knowing like, a porch that's less than 8 feet it starts to become hard to have furniture on and get around, right? So you say that there's all these little things that like architects and designers know, and that in the code is definitely kind of embedded in that. But when you explain it to an applicant, or they can know that before they come with an application, it's like, oh, that's why you're suggesting this is why the standard. Okay, great. And then they might see the value in saying, let's go beyond what the minimum is.
Yeah.
So like a guidance.
Another perfect example where I'd love to have a visual reference guide is to teach people, or to visually show how nonconformity works in different scenarios.
So you're reading my mind, and the contemporary example where you and I met on my property, like in my head, the code was no. This is gonna be a no, no, no. And maybe there's other residents that are coming from that, that place of assumption that, hey, my project will never work, and in 17 seconds of you being on my property, like, absolutely. I'm like, what? And I did not understand conformity, shoreland and setback.
Mhm.
If there was hey, if this, then this.
Mhm.
I mean, that'd be huge. Imagine the folks that are sitting there thinking they can't do anything.
Yeah.
And really, and you and I talked about this privately.
Yep.
And really they can.
There's a lot of opportunity, and I think seeing it visually helps a lot of folks, especially folks who have a hard time visualizing based on a written word,
And I don't know
which
many
sounds like legalese.
and I don't remember residents that are reading code for fun.
Well,
Yeah.
there's not many of us.
I'm just being real.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, the way the code is now, because all the images were removed, you go and look at the architectural components and they're all described in, kind of technical terms. And you have to kind of imagine, like, so when I was trying to figure out, like, what's a gallery? Like, what do we mean by gallery? And you're reading it and you're like, okay, I guess I get it. And then you go looking up like gallery, did a Google search, and obviously half of them come up it's not relevant, but it's like, okay, now I see what you're getting at. When you describe it, it sounds crazy. And then when you see it, you're like, oh, that, okay.
And
Okay.
to Ben's point, I think conformity is just as ambiguous. Like,
Yeah.
What is this?
Yeah. If we could provide some of the clarity, I think what you're talking about is kind of like the guidance of like, well, if you run into this problem, consider this. Because there's a lot of times where people do come to the town office, they talk to me or used to be George or Kevin and say like, I want to do this. And it's like, no, you can't do that. But if you do this, then you can do, you can do something close, or you can do it, but you have to go through this step first. And I think that would be,
And that's where you and I started.
Yeah.
Start off like here is the issue. Here's the land. Where's the yes? And let's work backward to that.
Yeah.
And the same thing with Kevin and George.
Yeah.
And that's correct. And you're talking about that.
and then that's,
So, I mean,
Yeah.
if personally, if I was to put anything on the top of my wish list, those two things would be at the top of my wish list. Other things like, erosion, sediment control, floodplain, mobile home parks, towers, wind energy, those, we don't deal with those as much. They probably just need to be more cleaned up than worked on.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
I think that with the floodplain especially, it's,
And the erosion sediment control ordinance, which is just, in my opinion, ridiculous, because like the first sentence says, if you have any permit that requires this, then you have to follow it.
right. And a lot of it is during construction stuff, where it's like, really what it should be is once you are approved to do a project, like like once you are doing the construction, code enforcement should be out there basically saying, yeah, you've got your erosion sock or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, you're doing that, and not have to like show the planning board Because it really should just be like, if you're building something, you need to make sure you're addressing this and not like, we're not approving you to build something unless you agree to follow it. It's like, you don't have to agree, but you're following it because it's basically. Yeah, that's. Why are we worrying about it? It should really be code enforcement.
I mean, I think with the timeline of the VPI, we could apply, like Scott, you were saying, a little bit of short-term, medium-term, long-term,
Prioritization.
yeah, on this, and say, maybe the visual reference guide is more short-term in the next year. The the streets thing, personally, I'd love to see if the select board would be willing to create a subcommittee to work on this instead of having them do it or have staff do it completely. Or there's a lot of pieces to that, and I see that as being a multi-year project, not just a, hey, let's bang it out in 6 months sort of thing. And it's too heavy, I think, for this committee. We'd have to pick up another meeting every month for 2 years to get it done, right? So that's kind of where my brain is moving.
So basically work on roads. It's not really just gonna be roads, driveways, and entrances, but thoroughfare stuff. And
I think the fact that there's a lot we don't address about roads and streets, sidewalks, street lighting, and I mean, just there's so much of that we don't do currently.
Yeah. I mean, the first step would just be to almost define what we're talking about when we're talking about roads. Because right now we have driveways, private roads, public roads, right? And there's a little more nuance to it than that in reality.
How often are we, sort of being caught? How often is that coming back and biting us? Because we don't have, obviously, we've got telephone poles in the middle of the sidewalk. But how often is this like, if we really had that stuff worked out, we wouldn't be having to deal with Mr. Smith's situation here. Does that happen a lot?
Well, we've butted heads with the roads, driveways, and entrances ordinance for things like we just changed the the minimum right-of-way width. Did we change that? No. we didn't.
Well, in the core zoning code, yes, but
But not in the
roads.
roads.
Yeah.
So we butted heads with that because that's a huge waste of space. It's just spelled out wrong. There's a lot of other stuff like that in the roads, driveway, and entrances ordinance that just needs to be tweaked to make more sense. And that could be considered its own project, or it could be considered rolled into this bigger project. Damascotta, for example, through their comprehensive plan, they are prioritizing in some areas bicycle mobility. And there was a lot of talk, from what I understand, about bicycle mobility and creating some sort of, bike lanes or shared bike lanes, or at least, like from point A to point B, there's bike access, things like that. There's a lot of talk about that stuff. And if we, reviewed what they had, adopted something similar, that would be a really healthy thing. To continue expanding bicycle mobility through both towns. Why wouldn't we do that? They're our neighbors. And the other thing I'd say, just that we butted heads with, at least at the select board level, I think Wanda, you were on the board when this was a problem with the new LED street lights, right?
Yeah.
So they're too bright in some places and not bright enough in other places, and they're shining in people's windows and keeping them awake, and they're too dark at this intersection. And how many times did people come to select board meetings to complain about the streetlights after they got switched out to LEDs?
Yeah.
I don't know, half a dozen times. So we have nothing about that in any way.
But that's tough too, because, what I think is okay shining in my window,
Yeah.
Scott, it's not okay to Scott.
Yeah.
I might
Yeah.
not care if it's bright. Somebody
Right.
else is gonna hate it if it's bright. So some of this stuff, I don't know how you.
Well, a good example would just be if you drive up Academy Hill. Okay, right? Before the overpass, there's no lamppost streetlights. They're all overhead gooseneck lights, way up high. After you go under the overpass, until you get up around Academy Hill, there are no goosenecks. They're all streetlights. And they're all the shielded downward facing ones. So they can't shine in anyone's bedroom. So an ordinance that says in these neighborhoods or on these streets or in these districts, for example, these are the types of lighting that are appropriate and these are the types of lighting that aren't appropriate. General guidance, that sort of thing would make a lot of sense, right? Because I completely agree with you. I don't care. I lived with Newcastle Chrysler's lights shining in my window for 10 years. You know, the noonday sun. It's crazy. I just put up a blind. Wasn't a big deal.
But, and I think it's this, it's similar with the, we were talking about sidewalks and tip downs, kind of figuring out what the state, what standards are out there, figuring out, oh, but we like this, and it doesn't have to could just start as like a policy thing of saying, this is where we start. So you don't have to keep doing the research and be like, oh, what kind of lights are out there? You need to put lights in? Well, let's start doing the research. You can say like,
Yeah.
here's 3, and here are the situations that are appropriate for, start there. There's a reason to go beyond it, then you gotta go beyond it, but at least it's starting.
So, yeah. I mean, I think that's a bigger thing. It's similar to, you know, the historic preservation ordinance that we attempted. That was what, year and a half? It was like a year and a half of work.
It started right after the code,
Or maybe it was 2 years then.
because didn't Ellen kind of head that up? In the
In the
beginning,
beginning,
I
maybe.
think it's
yeah.
one wound down.
And what
Been
is
a
that?
while.
And what is that?
The historic preservation ordinance, it was, yeah.
To
Look-
preserve historic sites.
Yeah, and like,
Historic structures and neighborhoods.
we have 1, 2 historic.
3.
districts.
Those two.
The
The Sheepscot Village is
Sheepscot-
one of them.
Sheepscot is one,
There's 3.
Mills is one, and then.
Glidden Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 3.
But it also tried to, you know, talk about like, historic structures in non-designated historic districts, things like that, you know, like for instance, Perkins Homestead, which is now a national monument.
Mhm.
As of a couple days ago. But ultimately that was voted down, so I think it's, at least from the select board's perspective, it's off the table for reconsideration until we do other things.
We wouldn't consider that a priority.
At the moment, I don't believe it is a priority unless you have a strong argument for it.
I don't have one for it.
So, does anyone else have any other arguments or thoughts or considerations on the list or off the list of things we should be thinking about?
I have one question about the list.
Yeah.
What is short-term rental ordinance?
It's a great question. Actually, that's on both ours and the select board's priority list. It's
Airbnb.
the attempt to put some arms around short-term rentals. Is the thought. There's a lot of towns and cities, not just in Maine, but all over the country that are grappling with, as you know, real estate values going haywire because of short-term rentals.
And I think too, like on Glidden Street is for an example, the people that live there, they like the neighborhood feel, and you've got people buying up the properties and putting on all these short-term rentals. You know, you kind of lose that neighborhood vibe. So they were gonna do it. At one point, we talked about doing it just so many weeks or so.
Yeah.
Couldn't like buy a piece of property and just, that was your sole purpose of in certain district, right? I think that's. if I
There was,
remember
I
that
mean, there
right.
was a bunch of different ideas about how to tackle it.
There's so many variations and just issues to consider around it. Not to say that it shouldn't be, but it's not quite as simple as saying less than a month is a short-term rental and you can or can't unless it's your primary, you know, there's all these,
It's a lot of nuance.
yeah.
And the priority to the town. I mean, if you live in that little area, and to you, it may be a really big deal. For the rest of us, it's like, yeah, do what you want with your property. You know, I mean, it's your property.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's really hard. It's,
Yeah, well, you could also leave it unregulated in some parts and regulated in other places. You could do basically just have people register. We don't even really know how many short-term rentals there are.
Well, and
There's,
at the moment, that's what we have. The system we currently have is that if you have a short-term rental, you need to register it as a use and
Yeah.
pay the fee.
But does that happen?
No,
No, yeah, exactly. No.
nobody knows they need to do that.
That's right.
that's, yeah, I think, because I know it is listed as a use in the core zoning code, but I don't know if like the mechanisms around it were built out or, you know, solidified, at least on the admin side.
Well, to be honest with you, those regulations were put in place before Airbnb came to Maine.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah. It's like there's something there and we could, you know, start with that and try and implement that, which really probably wouldn't be a whole lot of changing the code. It would be basically reminding people that they're supposed to tell the town they're doing it.
I guess unless you have a strong argument, I would say, since it's on the select board's priority list, maybe we could let them quarterback giving us direction on it. Oh, it is
Yeah.
gonna be dicey. It's gonna be controversial. Absolutely.
And it's really hard too, because we want workforce to come to the town. And I work in healthcare, so, we have, right now, we're using a lot of travelers. And I will tell you, these travelers cannot find housing. We have
Right.
lost travelers because they want to come.
Yeah.
But they can't come because they can't find housing.
Yeah.
So a short-term rental kind of thing in that case would be really helpful.
Yeah.
So,
And I think it's a kissing cousin to develop a housing development strategy.
Yeah.
Like those two kind of.
Yeah.
Might be hand in glove there.
Oh, definitely part of it, for sure. Yeah. But
because
again,
there
I think-
definitely is a need for housing,
oh, it's definitely a
It's
huge.
affordable housing.
affordable housing.
I hate that-
Absolutely.
Even
I hate that term.
short-term,
I
even-
hate that term.
Why? Well, because none of it's affordable.
No,
It's like affordable healthcare.
yeah,
Yeah.
Be-
Yeah,
because-
using that term,
I
Scott.
like it, you're button pusher.
because when people say, oh, we need more affordable housing, and then you propose affordable housing, the very first thing, the people who said,
Not-
yes, we need more affordable
Not in
housing,
my area.
will come out and say,
Not my.
I don't want section 8 next to me.
And that's
And
not
we're
what
like,
it
we're
is.
not talking about that. We're just talking about housing. We're literally just talking about
We're talking about
encouraging
housing
housing.
that somebody can rent and afford to
It's,
rent.
it's, take the word affordable and throw it away, because it doesn't mean anything.
Well,
No, I'm not barking at you. I'm
No,
just saying.
I totally get it. I
Yeah.
totally get it.
What's
yeah.
affordable to me may not be affordable to somebody else, so.
We just need housing.
It's like the word.
That's it,
reasonable.
we need to increase density.
We need to increase housing. Yes,
Intelligently.
intelligent, correct.
We need space for
Yes.
people to live.
And if you wanted healthcare to be more affordable, we would have less expensive housing where people would want to live here instead of travel here.
Yeah.
Because the travels cost a fortune.
Yes. Yeah. Yes,
Isn't the criteria for affordable no more than 30% of your total income?
that depends entirely on who you ask.
yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, I've heard that as a definition.
Well, that's
That's-
one definition, I
Yeah.
think. I don't know that that's the widely accepted definition.
I think that is like what HUD kind of uses when they
I've heard that all
the
over.
census takes, when they try to figure out who's housing cost burdened, that's very common to say 30%. When they work out the numbers for like for main housing, when they work out the numbers to say who qualifies for like income restricted or rent restricted, and there's different categories. It's 30% is they figure out the area median income, and then they say, okay, what would 30% of that be? Figure out what that is for 12 months, and
I
that's what
think
you're
it's
allowed to
even,
spend.
I think it's even different. I think the metric is even different if you apply for general assistance
Oh, yeah,
than it is if you, so like,
it is not a universal
it's,
at all.
it's a moving target.
Yeah.
But general assistance is a percentage of your income, yes, generally.
You talking about at the town? The-
No, in general, when somebody, for housing that is, rent controlled and whatnot. That is for people who live in an income.
Yeah.
Can't afford market rate, that's what they charge.
there's different programs,
Yeah.
whether it's
I think
state,
there are programs that
federal,
use that and
or local.
criteria.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
there's different programs and they all have different criteria.
That is a common one.
Yeah.
But it's not universal. This is what makes it hard, is there's a lot of different programs and standards, but I think I mean, I also remember hearing that as like, how much should you spend on a car? How much are you spending on, when you're trying to make a budget? It's like, yeah, 30% for housing. It's not easy
Well,
almost anywhere.
The Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission housing report that came out last year. Do you remember? I remember being completely blown away, but it was like the average family, monthly expenditures on housing was pushing like 42% or something ridiculous. Yeah.
That sounds right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No,
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
but I mean, like, that's
There is-
crazy.
There is something, the state of Maine tracks it and looks at, they do it by municipality, they do it by county. And just say like, what's the median income in the area you're looking at? And how many of the houses could you afford
Mhm.
if you spend,
Right.
30% of your income and you assume a certain interest rate for a mortgage and 30, they tie it down to what's like common. And
Yeah.
I haven't looked at it recently, but it was like Lincoln County was one of the last to switch from affordable to unaffordable compared to like the rest of the state.
Right.
But at least it was a year ago. I imagine it's not gotten too much better, if at all. It's like there was no counties anywhere.
Even like Washington County and places like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
It's all bad.
Yeah,
Bad everywhere.
because it really is comparing what the incomes are to what the housing costs are. And the problem is that
Income is lower there.
income where is lower, where housing prices are lower, and
So, what
You
the
gotta-
Bible bear.
housing prices went up, and it wasn't like people's incomes were going up. It was,
Yeah.
so,
But if you compare that to like the numbers from like the 70s,
yeah.
the 70s, it was housing costs were like 15% of your monthly income was housing.
Bought my first mortgage when my husband and I bought our first house. Was
Let me guess.
Was it in the teens?
Was it 18%?
16 and a half. We
16 and a half?
fought to find a 16 and a half with
Yeah.
a prepayment
Yeah.
clause.
And you happily
Was
signed.
this like right after?
Oh, yeah.
Half
Oh,
of
the
the
70s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, 16 and a half with no pre-penalty clause, because I mean, and a lot of them was more than that.
Yeah.
And we were just lucky to find one because we didn't want to do a pre-penalty, not have a pre-penalty
Right.
clause because
Right.
you couldn't get out of
You
it.
can get out of it. Right. Nuts.
The bank,
So now
kept-
people are saving
was a
up
change.
4 or 5%. You know,
the bank kept begging my dad to pay off his mortgage, but he had this really low rate. He's like, nah.
No, I'm gonna get that.
Yeah.
I'm making more money with my money in the savings account,
Right.
buddy.
But that was Paul Volcker, and he solved the inflation problem. Inflation was 10%, then it went down to 4 because of those interest rates. Sadly, it also created a giant recession in 1982 as well.
Right.
Right. All right, so you wanted to add a little bit more about some work that you're doing right now to this conversation before we sort of like try and pin down some actual hard goals.
Sure. Well, the conversation around when we talked about at the last meeting, there's kind of some of the conversations we've had and conversations we've had as a board, they're going in two directions. One, I want to make sure that we address additional structures, the minimum unit size and window and door standards. I mean, talking about that, I think we can basically make that something bite size and get that, maybe at the next meeting, we can get it to a place where we can send it to the select board for them to consider,
Yeah.
telling us to have a public meeting.
Yeah.
But then there's other stuff that's a little bit bigger. So I don't know if you want to discuss, and it's actually, honestly, most of it's pretty quick to go through the window and door standards, additional structures and minimum unit size stuff that I've got, or did you want to talk about like the building standards, the building types?
You've got it on here. At the moment, I wanted to know if anything that you've got there on your list to talk about
Mm.
under other business B
Yes.
has impact on what we're talking about now, which is goal setting for 2025.
This stuff doesn't directly, because I narrowed the scope to say like, we can get this done. What I would say is, because of those conversations, because of some of the conversations we've been having, I've been really thinking about trying to, some of the issues we had with the fabrication district property, creating a new lot and how that stuff all fit and what that building type was like. And trying to dive into what we could do around building types and the lot requirements.
Mhm.
And it started to make sense to me that we need to have some lot requirements, but a lot of I think the details can be tied to the building type. And then you can have it so that depending on which district they're in, they're like slightly modified, like the setbacks are bigger or smaller or whatever. And it also seems like it might make a little bit more sense if you tie, rather than saying, you can still say your lot needs a certain amount of frontage or needs to be whatever, but a lot of it, you can say, if you want to put this building on here, it needs to have certain frontage with it. The building is the thing that, so you want to have a bigger building, you need more frontage, or if you want a bigger building, you need to put more, the standards get higher, like you need more windows, or you need to have architectural components or whatever it is, so that one thing is that you can kind of encourage people to build, if they're going to build bigger, it needs to basically be nicer. And if they want to build smaller, the standards are loosened up, because then it's like, oh, I just want to build a house so you can get something started and move in, and it makes housing that's more kind of fine grained, that also will have a potentially smaller impact on the area. So if someone gets it wrong, it's like, all right, no, it's not the end of the world. It's a small building, and you can kind of reduce the barrier to like, yes, you can absolutely build something. And then it started to get into like, okay, well, what are these standards? I mentioned, so I started digging into the residential building types, and really if you're not talking about number of units, we don't really. Well, we're not gonna, we've already got, I think, the number of stories dialed in more or less for the districts. The big things with residential is really the number of doors, the number of entryways, and and then you kind of get setbacks. Like a townhouse is kind of a whole different animal than, a detached. But so basically saying like, how many doors should you be allowed to have on the front and or sides of a building? And you kind of like, if you have one door, it's going to look like a single family house. Assuming, we already kind of have the volume hemmed in. You start saying, okay, well, now we can have multiple doors, that's fine. And then it's multiple units, at least from the street. You're like, oh, this is clearly at least a 2-family or a 3-family, whatever it is. So you can start dialing that in. And then something that came up yesterday in a talk that I was part of was, you can also start to make allowances for building types that are particularly suited for like hazard mitigation. So if you've got something that's in a flood area, you're allowed to build, you can't say you're not allowed to build because your property is in a flood hazard area, but the standard is your house has to be up. So you're basically saying, okay, there's going to be different considerations for how high your first floor is from the ground versus, and that's one of the considerations that for any kind of housing, how high off the ground can it be? And so in a hazard, you say, okay, well, you're not allowed to have a foundation. You have to build it on pilings, or it has to be this high. And, well, if you do that, we can kind of reduce some of the other standards so that it's easier to build the appropriate house, because we're asking more, so we give more. So that was the kind of thing I just wanted to like kind of prime that. You can imagine the reason that I brought up fabrication district is fabrication buildings are a totally different animal than housing, or even like you can imagine the different kinds of commercial. And so one of the things I was thinking is we have these window and door standards, having them, and I actually think in the code, it already was kind of anticipating some of this, was you can have different standards, not wildly different, but you can say on the front of the building, the standard is minimum 20%. On the sides, you can go down to 15.
For different building types.
For different building types, yeah.
Which would clean up our problem that we had in the fabrication district. You could have a fabrication building type.
You have, yes.
And where you say, okay, it's really important to have windows and doors on the facade,
Right, on the
and
front.
it's not important on the back.
Right. Or even, or you can, and there's any number of ways to handle it. You can say, you know, you need, maybe you do need 20%, or maybe you need 10% on the back and sides, but you can basically take all three or all non-front sides and combine the 10% into one side. So it's like, you can have a blank back wall, but those windows get moved to the sides
But
or whatever.
I think last time we also talked about maybe it's help to usage. Because if you're doing major building in there or something, you don't need a whole lot of extra windows because
Of the use,
of the use.
right?
Right.
I mean, it's nice to have light, but you also,
Yeah.
you don't breakage either.
Well, maybe there's special building types that are more closely coupled to use.
Yeah.
This, okay, so I'm gonna just sort of bring us
Yeah.
back real quick to the conversation about goal setting. So to Scott's point, I think we've got a short-term goal of starting to develop the visual reference guide. We've got a medium-term goal of building out, flushing out, rehashing, working on building types.
Yeah.
And that scope sounds a little bit bigger to me than a short-term thing, but it doesn't
Yeah.
sound to me like it's more than just you bringing us stuff for consideration.
Yeah.
And then at some point in a year or two, maybe a year,
Yeah.
we put it on a warrant.
Right.
And then we've got the long-term goal, if everyone's amenable, of maybe making the suggestion that the select board form a subcommittee to address streets, a complete street ordinance, or make a recommendation for how to address
Comprehensive street
comprehensive street
project, whatever.
planning.
And on, sorry, I can't write and talk. On that, the first place that I started as I was going through the code to be like, well, how are we gonna do this, was just looking at lot standards, and so far I've just been starting with definitions around lots and lot lines. And I think there's some short-term opportunity to go through there and tighten a lot of those things up and make it so that there's no, the definitions are pretty airtight.
So between that and virtual lot lines, tightening those up as a precursor to working on building types.
Yeah, that's basically right now. I was just going through to be like, what exactly, where are the limits of lots?
Yeah.
And I'm just going through the definitions
Yeah.
and you can tell that there's some things that just, they didn't quite line up, and there's some, like, the names of things must have changed somewhere. It just kind of got a little jostled, and I think it's pretty straightforward to make it so that there's no argument as to whether or not this is a lot or building lot,
Right.
or what those things mean. So once we kind of define what the words mean, then we can start having the conversation of, well, how do we want to use them?
Okay. All right, so how does everyone feel about this as a work plan for the foreseeable? The only one thing I'd like to request that we vote on is if we do want to make a recommendation to the select board about developing more robust street planning, something, we vote on that so that it's official. They get notified that we want some action on that. If we don't want to do that, we don't have to.
And I just want to, for clarity, you're suggesting that the board vote to potentially recommend to the select board that they, consider putting together a committee.
Subcommittee that will focus on a comprehensive street.
As a lead up to the VPI work.
Yeah.
Which I think is well timed.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
I'll make a motion on that.
Thank you. We have a second. All right, motion and a second. Any more discussion about that idea? All in favor of making that recommendation to the select board? That passes 5-0.
Easy, good.
VPI to me is junior polytech.
That's right.
What is VPI?
Village Partnership Initiative.
That's it. All right, got it.
So there's just a couple things I want to touch on. I don't know if we need to discuss really. One of the things I sent you that is on the district pages is the removing of minimum unit size from of building tables, basically from the standards.
Well, we got feedback.
Yes.
We got
it's-
picked on. I'm gonna call it that we got picked on. It's not that we got feedback. It's that we are one of the very few
Yes.
form-based codes in the entire state. And as such, we are on people's radar. In particular, the folks who are administering LD 2003. And we made changes to be LD 2003 compliant. And then they went back and gave us some extra scrutiny just because.
Well, I
And
think,
that's why I'm saying I think we got picked on.
yeah, that's fair. But we also.
What is form-based? Just, I don't understand.
Uh,
A form-based code is another way of organizing a set of land use ordinances. Not just around use. So it incorporates other ideas, like building types. We're talking about building types. Frontage.
it- Yeah, I like, and we're not this extreme, and you don't typically get this extreme, but like one would be, the one extreme would be form-based code where you don't care what happens in the buildings or on the property, all you care about is the form of the building. So as long as it looks like a house, cool, you can do whatever you want in there. And then the other extreme is just like purely land-based, where use-based, where you say, we don't care what it looks like, we just care what the use is.
Like what's happening in the building or on the property.
And so,
They're almost two polarizations.
yeah,
Ours is a good, I think, mix right in the middle, where it addresses both pretty well, I think. The other thing I'd say about a form-based code versus a use code, because a use code doesn't really care, again, really about what anything, how big it is, how small it is, or its relationship to the street or anything like that. And a form-based code cares about that stuff a lot. So a form-based code is actually usually begun by measuring what you've already got to figure out how close houses are and how close they are to the street. All these measurements and metrics, you sort of, that's how you determine what your districts are. Does that make sense?
A little bit.
Instead of saying, here's the shopping district and here's the school district.
Right.
And here's the, suburban residential district. Which is how we learned how to. That's really how things started back in the 50s. Early
yeah, just, yeah, like the 20s.
20s, really, I guess.
Like-
20s Euclid versus.
Yeah, basically to separate uses was that's how planning zoning even was started. So it was basically to like separate
Separate
uses
uses.
from. It was, generally it was like, there shouldn't be industry near houses, but it's turned into a lot more.
Right.
So yes, basically the state, we asked them they made funding available. We asked them to give us the $10,000 that they told us that we could have. They told all the towns they could have if they made the changes. And so then we asked them for it, and they were like, "Well, did you make the changes?" And they went through and they did find, if you have a minimum unit size, that for essentially what the state said was every property is entitled to 2 units almost anywhere, with the exception of you still need to meet septic requirements, plumbing requirements, those kinds of requirements, and in shoreline. Those are the 2 things, which are also just like state set standards. But other than that, they're basically like, towns cannot tell you you're not allowed to have 2 units because they don't want to have 2 units. And so if the example that I use is if we have a minimum unit size of 400 square feet, and it only applies to the main building mass, which we can have a conversation about, we've discussed it. Essentially, if you've got a 700 square foot house, you can't have 2 units in there because it's not 800 square feet. And so if somebody had an 700 square foot house and came to the town and said, we want to put a second unit in here, and we said, sorry, you can't, because you need to have that would run afoul of this ADU.
LD 2003. Yeah.
So we added in minimum unit size because it was a conversation we were having, because we don't have minimum or maximum unit counts. Again, we regulate the size of a building so that it's not an overwhelming building.
Yeah, Yeah, as a matter of fact, this, something that we tell applicants when we can, is we're not interested in your floor plan.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to see the blueprints. Because our code doesn't really care where the walls and the bathrooms and the living rooms and the bedrooms, like, we don't care. What we care about are the elevations. Where is it located on the lot?
Yeah.
How far is it set back? How big is it? How tall is it? How deep is it? Those are the things we're concerned about.
Yeah.
We don't
And the building code still exists, so it's not like people can get crazy with. Like, if you have a dwelling, you still need to have a bathroom and kitchen facilities and somewhere to sleep, so you only get so small, but. So anyway, so that, I don't think there's a whole lot of discussion to be had on it. Happy to have whatever discussion you want, but basically that's the one change for the removal of minimum unit size. It's just in those tables, just cross it out.
Anybody object?
But,
Make the state happen.
Okay, then.
Then the next thing that's in the same document is, I think it's all the way in the fabrication district. Should be the last page in there. So the second to last page, 38, at the bottom, I put in building standards number 4. Window and door standards do not apply to the rear and sides, up for discussion. Facades of buildings which exclusively contain transportation and utility uses, agricultural uses, industrial uses, or a mix thereof. When the facade is more than 150 feet from Academy Hill Road.
I like it and I hate it.
Yeah, it's a start. So I want some discussion on it. That's kind of how
Okay, I'll tell you what I like about it, and I'll tell you what I hate about it.
yes.
I don't like that we're essentially bubbling again. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
Yeah.
I don't like bubbles. Not a fan. You guys know what I mean when I say bubbles? When we're putting a pin on a map and we're putting just like we did for the firearm sales, where you say, okay, if you're going to have this use, here's your bubble. You can't have this use within so many feet of these other uses.
oh, you're saying with the 150 feet from Academy Hill.
Yeah, I don't, that's the part I don't like. The rest of it's fine, but I understand what you're trying to go for, because the fabrication district really is, well, I mean, we keep reading this and I love that we've got descriptions and statements of purpose for every district that we can refer to. Because if I say fabrication, it might mean something different to you than it does to me. But here we've got words. Fabrication special district allows a mix of industrial, office, retail, live, works, flex spaces, and other supporting development. And the purpose is to accommodate more intensive industrial uses in a way that is compatible with and in proximity to higher density residential areas, to support existing industrial uses and provide an area for their expansion, to allow for residential uses that are compatible with industrial activities. So it's not just warehouse. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a true mix of stuff, and residential is right in there with it and should be right in there. And so I get what you're saying because the fabrication district is bifurcated by, Academy Hill Road.
Yeah.
What is built in the fabrication district and fronts onto Academy Hill Road, we'd probably be more interested in having it look more residential, or at least facade facing, road facing, than industrial, right? Is I think what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
The other thought that I had is, given that it is the fabrication district, and you kind of want a mix of uses in there, it wouldn't be entirely inappropriate to have a lower standard for window and door percentage. Like, you could put it at 10%, and I don't think it would be, it's like, well, yeah, it's a fabrication district. It's not neighborhood residential district.
Except the residential buildings are already on Academy Hill Road.
You're right.
I guess I'd probably be more in favor of something like what we do in the downtown district
With the street front.
with the shopfront
Shopfront.
streets, where we have a definition that says this is a shopfront street. If you build a building on this shopfront street, it has to contain a shopfront. And here's what that means, right? Windows facing the road, public access on the main floor. You know, the main floor, ground floor, entryway, with the windows and the door is, you know, commercial, can't be residential. Things like that. And so if we had, just, if we stayed a little bit more true ourselves in terms of how our ordinance is set up. And we created something like that in the fabrication district because it is a mix. And we say. Road facing residential structures on Academy Hill Road in the fabrication district. Have this set of standards for windows and doors behind. Or everything else has this other set.
So are you, because I guess what I had kind of thought about that, just saying, except for facades that face Academy Hill. And my thinking was like, once you get to a certain distance back, if there's nothing in front of you between you and Academy Hill and you're 150 feet away. Like, you need to have a facade that looks. Like, you know, that meets that standard, which we can say, I think what you're, so the other. Thought was, if we designated some version of like a shop front. Except it wouldn't be shop front, are we kind of making all the buildings face Academy Hill?
No. Just the ones on the road.
That's what I mean, the buildings, like, so you couldn't have Academy Hill, I guess really never gonna be your secondary frontage. Your front.
It's never gonna be your secondary frontage, no. But at the moment, you can envision a situation where, God forbid, fire takes out a building. Or it's demolished and a big steel building is put up in its place. There's no regulation right now that says it has to face Academy Hill Road or that it has to have, you know.
Well, no, it has, well, kind
But
of,
behind it, there's a tire retreading plant, so if they don't rebuild the house, that's what they're looking at.
Yeah,
well,
or they move that right up to the sidewalk.
but you do have.
And that would drastically change, imagine
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
You do have to face. Well, the frontage is, oh, it's gonna be Academy Hill. I mean, I can't imagine a more major road other than Route 1. That you're gonna. You know, if you abut Academy Hill and either one of the other,
Yeah, but we
Private
don't have
roads.
building orientation in this district. There's no building orientation.
okay,
So I guess what I'm saying is carve out a standard for Academy Hill Road in the fabrication district
mhm,
that includes, you know, considerations of windows and door standards, building orientation standards, roofs. So for example, one of the things that we were very concerned with way back when, I'm going back a long time, was having single story flat roof buildings
Yeah.
scattered here, there and everywhere. Terrible, right? So we really locked them to very specific districts, and this is one of the districts where we allow flat
Yeah.
roof buildings. The only other one that we allow flat roof buildings in is highway commercial. Only those two districts. So you could conceivably knock down a residential building right now and put up a single unit flat building that is 45 degrees or 37.5 degrees
Canton.
canted to, and yeah, that's cool, right? But now you've completely changed the district, You've completely changed the district. And do we want that?
Yeah.
Do we care necessarily beyond
that's right.
the front row facing? No, right? We don't. I don't think we do. But right on the road? Yeah, I kind of do.
So it sounds to me like maybe the orientation standard, building orientation should apply only along Academy.
But that would be a bubble, wouldn't it?
No, I think like a shop front street, we create
Okay.
a call out and we say, you know, this is a,
So many
we'll think of,
feedback from them.
not even that, we'll just say like, if you have a building that fronts on this type of
Right.
road,
Okay.
then these are the standards.
That fronts on,
So if it fronts on Academy Hill Road, here's the standards. If it doesn't front on Academy Hill Road and it fronts instead on Teague Street or on Depot Street or on not Hall Street, but I don't think Hall Street's in the fabrication district, it's below it. But yeah, so, but if you have if it fronts on those other streets, well, you know, the regulations are loose.
if it only fronts on. You mean like a corner lot at Teague and Academy Hill, it's gonna front onto.
Academy Hill,
Yeah.
because that's the larger road.
It's the larger-
Right.
So, yeah, so if your lot, and really if you have a virtual lot even,
Same deal.
then. Yeah, okay. I think they can
Can you craft something around
do
that?
something like that, yeah. What I will also say is that this was a little bit of a, I think, a kind of a Band-Aid, because I think a lot of the way that I was imagining like building type things is that it kind of addresses this. You can very quickly say, if you've got a building, as long as you're telling it that it, you know, the building is going to front on Academy Hill, you can kind of you can basically say your fabrication type building has to do something like this. So
I'd still prefer to do this, even though it's a little bit more of a Band-Aid,
yeah, no, it's
and then replace
Yeah.
it with the greater work you're gonna be doing
that's
over
my figure.
a little bit more
Yeah.
time.
Okay, so I will try and craft something that basically designates just that stretch of Academy Hill within the fabrication district. I mean, both sides of the street presumably, but
Well, I mean, at the moment, I think that's true, because that's,
Well, I think the other districts already have that in it. It's just the fabrication district, so it's that stretch.
I think it is important to call that out.
well, because right now the only equivalent to this, you know, frontage requirement, that thing we're talking about is the shop front requirement along Main Street.
Correct.
So we're basically creating shop front with different standard for that sort of Academy Hill.
Yep.
Okay. So it's not gonna be shop fronts, but
It'll be,
it'll be the
it'll have another
fabrication.
clever name.
Yeah, I'll try. Um,
Have a good acronym,
yeah, oh, okay.
so we can just confuse everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, well, just like, okay. And essentially we're thinking, is it like that the window and door standards apply along those streets, the frontages onto Academy Hill, and do not apply to any buildings not?
What I would start with is, right now, window and door standards in all districts apply to all, basically four sides, but all elevations of the building.
Mhm.
So, just for consistency's sake, we designate the buildings that front onto Academy Hill Road and with their window and door standards and orientation standards. And those buildings have to be considered on all sides. And then behind that, other buildings, I would say, you know, whatever you think is appropriate, but only on the side that faces the frontage, not on any of the other sides. AKA, if have a building on Teague Street that's, you know, not fronting on Academy Hill Road, but fronting on Teague Street.
Yeah.
10% minimum windows and doors on the frontage only,
And,
on the facade only, and
No
the other
requirement.
three sides,
okay, that's what I wanted to know was
I agree with that.
how much do you reduce the other stuff? But that answers that question.
That, I mean, I think the combination of those standards really does address this mix that this district is trying to go for.
Mhm.
You're maintaining the residential on the road. It's got sidewalks and walkability. That should be maintained
Yeah.
for residential use. But we're encouraging by lessening some of the standards for, you know, mixed use and commercial buildings, single unit, flat roof buildings, if they want it, in the fabrication district that don't front onto Academy Hill Road.
Yeah.
I'm talking too much. We good?
I've got a rookie question.
Yeah, no, great, go for it.
So I'm struggling with the sort of the individuality of all the towns in Maine.
Yeah.
And maybe it's like the universe, is so large, there's gotta be some lights out there somewhere, right? Well, I'm thinking. There's a lot of town plans. I mean, is there a clearinghouse where you can find the perfect language from Blue Hill that solves our problem?
More like Freeport. Like,
Don't. Good point.
No, okay, so the
Yeah, you
answer,
understand the question? I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
I got
thinking
the
that there's gotta,
yeah, we don't
what,
have
is that a
to,
bad one?
Well, no, when we were doing
Well,
the
the
code
only
planning,
reason I think
when we
about
were
it,
doing the code planning, the original draft, they
Yeah.
were trying to make us Freeport.
well, yeah, I mean, there was a
Anyway.
lot of like comparisons to Freeport and everything, and everybody's like, "What? Freeport?" But I know where you're going.
like,
and I
I
totally
don't,
get it.
I absolutely don't mean that in a derogatory.
No,
manner,
no.
yeah,
Because like, I'll tell you right now, you know, like part of the draw to this town and this community, you know, is turning up that hill and, you know, being presented with, you know, the academic gem of Lincoln Academy.
Mhm.
You know, and you want to preserve that feel.
Right.
You know, just like when you came off of the 295 exit, you start heading toward Main Street, Freeport, and take that right.
Yep.
Even though that's a McDonald's.
Yep.
It is a 3-dormer cake.
Right.
With white cloud
Yeah.
balls.
Right.
You know, like.
Yeah.
Sure, whatever. In that district, they were allowed to do that. However, it does present itself very well.
Yep.
And I didn't mean that first.
No, no,
But
no.
I agree,
It-
I agree with Scott.
I'm just
Scott?
asking,
Is it Scott?
it is Scott.
Yeah, I agree with Scott.
My instinct is always somebody has solved this somewhere, and we
Yeah.
wouldn't have to work with
Got,
it.
can't be the first person.
We
to
could
triple.
find it and steal their language.
But
That's fine.
Picasso.
Yeah.
Said, good artists copy. Great artists steal. And yes, whenever possible, I am fully like, let's just steal that. Take that idea, tweak it a little, and make it ours. Absolutely. This is simple enough. I don't think we need to go looking.
Okay.
But in any other context, absolutely.
Is
Still
is
reinvent
there-
the wheel.
Is there a clearinghouse?
No.
Is it? No, okay,
No.
never mind.
Especially not for like Fort Biggs.
Well, all these towns may want
In Maine.
to, they want their own deal, but you know,
That is correct. Home rule. Home rule, they want the expression of. what
I
they feel they
appreciate
are.
that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we kind of stepped outside the box when we created code stuff.
Yeah, I will tell you, when I had a conversation with people from Maine Housing about the LD 2003 issue, they did say, like, we think, we're not sure exactly this is an issue. Because we don't do a form-based codes very often. You're one of 3.
Yeah.
So they also were like,
Yeah.
we don't, it's not a problem, we just don't.
Yeah, we just don't get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fine.
So, yeah, we're a little, there are definitely other examples, and I
Okay,
do start when all the stuff that I've been looking at for like the building types and stuff, I went back to textbooks about form-based code, and it's like,
Yeah.
smarter people than me, put much more time. into it.
Practice nuts, absolutely. A lot more time. All
All
right.
right, so that's that. The last thing is in the other document, core zoning code, the additional structures, just that one page. The under C,
where are you, Bob?
this was in core zoning code. It's the last document. It's 6B2.
Working edits. Additional structures, working edits, PDF.
So if you go down under that additional structures, that 8 under C general number 5 there. It says marina dry storage use shall be permitted to construct additional structures up to 1,200 square feet in area. I do need to add in there as long as the use is active. But other than that,
Yeah, and I'd actually maybe think about doing once the use is discontinued, the additional structure must be, removed within X number of days.
yeah.
Or fines will start accumulating.
Or
So-
yeah, or it'll be a violation.
Yeah, so just so everyone's on the same page, this is a proposal to help Newcastle Marine, which is Robert Blood, find a way to actually make what he's doing legal, not just for him, but in the general sense for the town. If you have a use that's similar in nature to his, where you need larger additional structures, we have no permitting path for that at all. So we have a permitting path for additional structures if you want to build a garden shed or a chicken coop. Or, you know what I mean? Things like that, small little things in all these districts, right? 300 square feet, 150 square feet, blah, 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 right? 500 square feet. But if you have a marina like he has, and he needs to work on boats under these larger boat canopies that are temporary structures. In other words, they don't contain, you know, it's not a foundation, it doesn't have plumbing, it might have electricity, but it doesn't have insulation. You know what I mean? Like,
Can't have a dwelling unit in it.
it doesn't have a dwelling unit. It's just a temporary structure.
Yeah, well, it's relatively temporary. It doesn't fit the definition of temporary structure
For
here,
sure not.
but it's not something that's gonna be up for 40 years.
It's a boat shelter.
Yeah.
It's a
Right.
boat shelter.
Right.
But the point is, like,
So I'm unfamiliar. What's the problem?
He's not legally by our code able to do that because of the amount of square footage.
right?
Right
Was
now-
it not a business before?
Yes.
It was, but right now he wants to put up new additional structures that are more than 300 square feet. And so we can't do that.
Right.
And not just that
And technically, he put those ones up after this one went into effect. And it just slipped through the cracks.
Yeah.
So he just kept putting up these, he's got what, 6 of them now?
I think.
These boat covering like hoop
Yeah.
house things, you know?
And there
Yeah.
are other buildings that are on, or structures, I should say, that are on his property that were already there that
Right.
also kind of fit this, that are, you know, are legally non-conforming, or, you know, it's fine, but it's like, it would be good if we can accommodate something like this, because it's like he already had them. They weren't accommodated in the code originally. It's not unreasonable. I mean, clearly he wants to have more, any boat use or, you know, marina dry storage use is gonna want something like this, so.
And in the fabrication district, this is exactly what we want
Right.
to allow.
Right.
It should be allowed.
Yes.
Yeah.
There needs to be a clear permanent path forward for him.
Yeah.
And other people that might want to do similar things. So,
So so assuming, and I checked this 1,200 square feet, like with him was basically like, it's about as big as he's gonna wanna go. I think it was to be 20 by 60. Or maybe it was 25 by 50, I think was like, he was like, 20 by 50 is where, you know, is about the biggest boat. So assuming that's that, you know, we don't have to say, oh, well, if he wants it, then we give it to him. It can be less. We could do 1,000 or 5, you know, something like that. But assuming there's no issue with that, I have a couple other questions. One, I also upped just the default size for other structures for non-marina dry storage from 300 to 500 in the fabrication. Just because it seemed like that was a reasonable place to do it. And I also removed the screening requirement.
which is impossible in that district anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought.
What is
So-
screening?
So it means you have to have a vegetated buffer essentially of a certain type. It's defined in the code between you and other uses, usually residential or a road, public road, or something like that. But in the fabrication district, you wouldn't be able to get that amount of space to create the correct amount of screening.
Yeah.
Anyway. So,
And it's not the only district that would not require screening. So, so there's that. The last thing is, I'm just noticing right now, I just have this basically saying marina dry storage uses. Doesn't specifically say in the fabrication district. So should we only accommodate this for marina dry storage in the fabrication district? And I'll tell you what other districts it's allowed in.
Well, isn't there a
Marine.
boatyard right over there?
Marine, you're allowed, you know, well,
that's in the
marine,
Marine district,
Oh,
different,
okay,
Yeah.
of course.
I know. It's the only thing we have in the Marine district.
yeah, which is a little bit
I have to think that there are gonna be other
rural highway.
Well, what if someone wants
temporary
to,
shelters for
what if someone's-
fabrication, other than boats.
What about like
Actually,
a
yeah.
lumberyard?
Yeah. Yeah.
or someone wants to store their 45-foot boat on their property?
What if someone wants to do a lumberyard in the
This is very common where I'm.
rural highway or rural, or I guess.
Yeah.
You can do it Could you do it in the middle
What's that?
of a lumberyard?
You could, but you'd have to have 10 acres.
Yeah.
Yep. Minimum. But you could.
But there are people who put up these kind of shelters to build their own boats in.
True.
Yes,
There's one in Sheepshead that, it's been up for
Mhm.
ever, he built a sailboat.
Yes.
So many people do.
Yep.
Put them up to,
So the question, I guess, then becomes, are there different considerations regarding these larger additional structures that vary district to district? AKA, like we just said, in the fabrication district, maybe they don't require screening, but maybe in another district, screening would be appropriate, or a different setback might be appropriate if it's allowed. You know what I mean?
Or maybe-
And for example,
or
maybe
a time frame, different time frame. Maybe it's just seasonal.
it could be seasonal, you have to take it down.
Well, that's, then you get into temporary structures, like if you want to have if it's just the one and you want to do a temporary structure,
Like a one-off.
yeah, we can do that. We already allow it's 3 months. Just seeing if there's limits on the size, if it's actually a temporary structure. You know, if you just want to like store your boat for the winter. If you want, I mean, you want to do it for
Full
more than,
disclosure, this is the first thing I did when I bought my house. So,
You build a thing for,
yeah, I got like a 20 by 20.
Yeah.
Had a strap in a 2x4
sure,
and shrink wrapped it.
no, it's very common.
so,
But, you know, I think the standards might vary district to district. So for example, we may want to not allow additional structures up to 1,200 square feet in historic. Or, I mean, you know, town center, village business,
yeah.
maybe not even village residential, because those are tighter neighborhoods, you know,
Right.
where the density is greater. And so sticking these large buildings in between eats up a lot of space.
Well, so are you saying that specifically with this, or is that like a consideration for further down the road? Because right now, dry storage isn't, I can't imagine it's allowed in.
I think what Benson does further on down the road, other districts, I think for what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think we can make this change and just lock it to fabrication for the moment, with the understanding that we need probably a more comprehensive, and maybe additional structures and temporary structures just gets combined into one thing, and we spell it out very clearly. And there's a couple of different tables that describe in different districts, here's the different standards
Yeah.
of, you know, temporary versus additional, time frame, size, blah, blah, blah.
Well, that kind of gets into what I was saying before about, you know, smaller buildings having looser standards, bigger buildings having.
Yep.
This would fall below like a building, it's the structure, you're basically saying like, if you're building, you're doing you know, this is it's 1,200 square feet, it's not that small, but if you're doing something like that, small building, you know, then this is kind of how you accommodate a structure.
Right. Versus if you're building a chicken coop,
Yeah, right.
just go for it.
Yeah,
300 square feet, we're like,
Right.
cool, got
Yeah.
it. But I just want to say the fabrication, tying into fabrication, there's only highway, commercial, rural, if you have an expanded use, rural highway and marine.
Oh, for the marine dry storage? use?
Yeah, it's
Well, then
only
don't tie it
those-
to fabrication.
It's only those 4. I figure like this.
Yeah, it's
wouldn't
fine.
be out of place
It'd
there.
be fine.
Okay, so
It'll
I'll
be
leave
fine.
that.
Yeah.
Then I don't think that, well, what I will say is the under D screening, I tried to clarify that, just make it a little bit more clear, which is screening is only required when it is identified as being needed on the table, and then it's only required to screen the additional structure from view from public roads, which I think is what was being
Yeah.
said there.
Yeah.
Okay. And
I think that's fine. The only other thing, the screening's fine with me. The only other thing it doesn't really spell out in additional structures, I'm not sure it does in temporary structures. Is that all of temporary structures? No. So the criteria that, you know, maybe we just say like additional structures can't have a foundation, can't have plumbing,
Yeah, this was, okay.
and
so
can
this
never
is
be used as a dwelling unit.
yes,
Can't be converted into a dwelling
Right.
unit.
For additional structures, it does say additional structures shall not contain a dwelling. It's, you know, it says that under generals, the first thing,
Oh, yeah, right.
but it doesn't really get into anything else, which is where I was like, well, can you plumb it? I think that someone building you know, a small shed and wants to have a, you know, garden spigot. It's like,
That's different than building a 1,200-foot building that is insulated and has plumbing.
yeah, right.
This
So,
is a quarter step into turning it into a dwelling unit.
yeah, no, and so that's where I'm saying, like, you know, if you just say like no plumbing, then it's like, well, I got a 300-foot shed here that I want to have a spigot in, but it's not allowed to have plumbing.
Okay, so this
So-
goes on the list of tease it out later.
Yeah.
This is fine, I think, for now, yes.
Somewhere I'd have to look, but I thought when we did this originally for these structures, we said you could do this or this, but you can't do all of them. So you couldn't turn it into, like, you couldn't have electric and plumbing, or you couldn't have,
Yeah, that was in the character code. It didn't come over.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
I know we
I
talked
looked-
about it
We did a lot and I looked for it and it didn't.
because that's exactly what we were trying to get at without saying. Because if you didn't let him do everything, then you couldn't turn it into a
Yeah.
dwelling at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
But that didn't fall.
It didn't pull over. And maybe go back and look at that.
Yeah.
Don't reinvent the wheel,
The-
just grab that language.
Right.
Because
no,
we
that
did
makes a lot of
talk
sense.
a lot about how did we make it so that somebody couldn't turn that into, you know,
Yeah.
live in it at some point.
And that's where, you know, when does what's the, you know, that threshold between additional structure and accessory building? Right now, they're pretty far apart. So there's kind of this in between where it's like, well, you don't need to, it doesn't need to be an additional accessory building, but it also shouldn't be as
Yeah,
minor as an additional structure.
and it doesn't clearly say it, but I think it's commonly assumed that an accessory structure can have a full foundation, fully insulated, be fully plumbed,
Right.
fully wired.
Yeah.
And be used as any of the uses that are allowed in that district.
Yeah.
And an additional structure, that's not the idea or case. So.
No, yeah, right.
We really should at some point say,
If someone has a pre-existing barn, can they turn it into an ADU?
well, pre-existing is a different situation.
Oh,
No, it's a good question. Because if you have something that exists but is not compliant, it's a pre-existing non-conforming thing that you can continue to have until it either is demolished and you want to rebuild it, or you want to make substantial enough changes that you need to bring parts of it into compliance.
so can you turn a barn into a residential?
Can't really answer that unless we see the specifics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Depends on the specifics. But
Short term, sure.
Potentially,
potentially, yes.
potentially you could turn it into.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah, potentially.
follow whatever.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah, but I can't just say yes or.
No.
See it. I see the specifics. If you're talking about your barn,
Just a
Talking about
barn,
your barn now.
a barn.
It would depend on any other dwelling units on that. I mean, there's so many.
there's a lot.
He's just asking for a friend.
Yeah, ask.
Asking for a friend, that's gonna be our motto. Okay, I like that.
Just
Asking
asking
for
for-
a friend. Can you turn a barn into an ADU?
You
Just
know,
curious.
that is also, that came up with a building type thing, is to say like a barn is a building type that isn't really, it's bigger than most of the accessory
Yeah.
buildings that are allowed.
Yeah.
But it's also pretty quintessential to the area.
It's also could be bigger than the farmhouse. I mean,
Yeah,
some
right,
big
yes.
barns out
Yes,
there.
absolutely. And we want to, I mean, I just drive around all the time and I see so many examples of the big house, little house, back house, barn.
Right.
They are everywhere.
Yeah.
And people just do them naturally. And the barn is huge.
Yeah.
The house is dwarfed
Oh, sure.
by the barn, right? And oftentimes it's like, that's the thing where I really want to go explore that barn. That is so cool,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so to not be able to really allow that to happen is unfortunate.
Yeah.
I think we have to, I've been arguing that there are certain types of buildings that are more closely coupled to use than a standard sort of generic building type.
Yeah.
And so like, I'd love to explore the possibility of creating a category of building types that are like special building types.
Does this go back to our conversation about visual reference guides?
Yeah,
Interesting.
I mean, people turn churches into houses.
exactly. Thank you.
I actually lived in.
Perfect. How cool is that?
I think that,
So that's not so far from turning a barn into a house.
No,
you know,
no.
and I think that this is, you know, if we can get some of these more specific building types where you can start to say, okay, you're allowed to do that because it's this building, like fabrication, we're like, you can have less windows. You specifically say you can't put a residential use. Right? It's like, so that way you can't just be like, oh, it's a fabrication building and I'm putting a bed in it, so
Sure.
I don't have to put windows. But,
Right,
you know, it's like,
right.
so that's where again, tonight I'm all about, what are the boundaries? How could you try to, when do you cross the boundary into, it's not that anymore, or now you're this.
Right.
That's further down the road. That's all I got. I just want to make
Great.
I don't want to cut that conversation.
No, that's great.
Usually-
And I said we wouldn't be here 2 hours and we're coming up on 2 hours. So I think if you're all set.
I just have a couple of things I wanted to mention about the planner's report, which is, if you didn't know, well, you mentioned shoreline zoning, the minor amendments got approved at the special town meeting, so now timber harvesting is administered by the state. If you want to do timber harvesting
In the
in the
shoreline.
shoreland, get in touch with the state. You can get in touch with the town. We'll put you in touch with the state. That's been submitted to the state. I can't see any reason why they would reject it. And then the other thing, this is kind of the work related to the work plan thing, but I am going to make a push to get the admin stuff like just locked in. You know, just as it's been fallen by the wayside, so I come and get like, you know, three months of minutes to you, and I'm trying to just get on it so it's regular, but the process stuff is.
That's cool. No, that's great.
Still being-
And that's ongoing. That'll never end. Unfortunately.
That's, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
the-
Do we have any public comments?
Thank you to Michael for putting all the documentation on the web.
Awesome. Awesome.
Formally, thank you. I looked at it all.
That's-
Great.
I have
And it
been,
was tremendously helpful tonight.
the link that
Thank you
I,
for planning board work.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Work list.
the link that I share with the planning board, I just make it available to view as
Yep.
members of the public.
Yep.
And so I can also then, what I'm trying to do is make it so I can put like a tentative agenda on there.
Yeah.
like a month ahead of time.
Oh, yeah.
And as things get done, I can put them up there, and then
It just updates.
it just is.
Yeah. Genius.
And I could read the zoning code.
There you go.
Excellent.
Yeah, I don't know, I didn't know where you could find it. When, was it posted anywhere?
Oh, it's always
Good
been on the
bit,
website.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. You can actually search for core zoning and it'll pop up.
But we've been making pretty good progress on the website, getting all the orders.
All right. The time is 8:25 and without objection. Meeting adjourned.
Are we compelled to bring?